It's time to take a new approach to finding true fulfillment in your career, health, and state of mind through insightful conversations with those who have found their professional and personal passions while achieving balance. Whether it's entrepreneurs, athletes, or healthcare professionals, we bring you real people, real growth right here on the Boost Podcast. Now, here's your host, Elena Lipson.
Hey Boost Squad, and welcome to episode 12. Elena Lipson here, and I am fired up to introduce today's featured guest, Suzie Ivelich. Suzie, are you ready to join the Boost Squad?
Absolutely.
Great. So Suzie is the founder of Suzie Ivelich Consulting and a branding expert based in San Francisco. She's worked on branding everything from small startups to large corporations, not-for-profits, and even individuals. She's a guest expert on branding at the UC Berkeley Haas School of Business, and she loves working with students to learn from them as well about brand and design. She began her career as an English teacher in Japan and spent time working in agencies and other organizations, including Accenture, in both Japan and the US. And we have so much to discuss with Suzie today to learn from her experience abroad and her journey, as well as tips on how we can brand ourselves both professionally and personally. So Suzie, I want to know from you, what are the 3 things that we should know about branding?
Well, thanks, Elena. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a really fun area to talk about and to fall in love with, from my opinion, but I'm totally biased. I think it's a long-term play. You know, people who want to have a good brand and a solid brand, they have to be able to invest in it for the long term. And that includes people, and it includes corporations, nonprofits, what have you, sports teams, you name it. So I think that's really important. The second thing, you really can't be all things to all people. You know, sometimes you meet with clients and they're like, we need to get everybody to understand this. And that's been over the arc of my career, is always trying to get people to focus in on what's your thing, you know, what is the most important thing. And I think, you know, just in short, the third thing that's really important is often folks want to change direction very quickly because they get bored with their brand. And what I try and counsel is, if you're bored, it's probably, we have to take a look at how we're implementing your brand, how we're executing your brand. But let's make sure that the folks you want to influence or target really know what you're all about, that they're aware of you, that they think that you're relevant, that they understand you, they want to be your advocates before we change anything. And so just being bored is probably not always the best reason to change your brand. I guess those are the 3 that I would start with.
Okay, I want to ask you a little bit more about some of that. So when you are trying to get a client to focus on long-term planning, I know a lot of times clients want to see quick results. And so how do you kind of help them find those metrics to know that they're on the right path when it does take a long time to develop your brand?
Well, we look at metrics that you can measure in the short term, and then we try and identify the metrics that matter that take a little bit longer. So you can build awareness, and it just depends on who you want to build awareness with. If you want to build awareness with a small group, you can probably do that very targeted and measure it very quickly. And that's what we like to do when folks want to see short-term results. But it's not just good to be aware of a brand has to be understood. So that's something that we try and measure right away, is, do people understand, you know, what you stand for, what you're all about? So I remember one time we were working with Canon a long time ago. We looked at some data for them, and in one of the countries where they really wanted to do more business, everybody knew their name, but nobody could tell you what they did. So that's something that you can measure, you know, pretty much in the short term in different audiences. And then you want to look at the long-term metrics that make sense, like, do people really like your brand? Do they want to recommend you to others, what we often call advocacy? Are they willing to do that? Because that really, you know, makes them have to use their own reputation, and people rely upon them for their, you know, recommendations. And that usually takes more time.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting what you brought up about people wanting to change their brands because they get bored. And we live in such a fast-paced society with information coming out by the second, and people have very short attention spans. So what are some of the things that you look for when someone comes to you and is like, yeah, I'm just kind of tired of my brand. It feels stale. Let's do a rebranding. Like, what are the things that you kind of look for to evaluate to see whether that's really the right direction to go in?
Well, that's when brand becomes a little bit like therapy. We usually ask why. What is prompting this feeling of boredom? Because that's not enough. And we try and counsel clients to really then examine. I know it kind of sounds frou-frou and it's a typical San Francisco comment, but we try and get more into what's going on. And so what's going on in the market? What are competitors doing? Are your sales dropping? Are you not reaching the people that you want to reach? So we start to really take more of a methodical approach to dissect what's going on with the brand. And if something's really happening that's affecting sales or affecting the results that you need, then we can talk about, okay, what are the things that we should do to either adjust or do some kind of full-scale change if that's necessary.
Yep, that makes sense. And what are you finding that are some of the common misperceptions that people have around creating a brand?
Well, in the old days, people always thought brand equaled an advertising campaign. Thankfully, that's not the case anymore. Folks are much more savvy. They know what brands can do. They know the power of brands. They know that brands can contribute to value. But I think still one of the ones I come across is, especially with startups, I'll say, in the beginning, they don't think it's that important. They focus more on the technology or they focus on the mechanics of what their thing can do rather than the fact that they have to think about also how is it represented in the marketplace. And so I meet a lot of founders who will say, well, my brother came up with the name, and this includes nonprofits, where they'll say, in the beginning, my brother or my uncle or my cousin's friend came up with the name. I showed it to my spouse, my significant other. They liked the design. So then we went with it. And now we have our third round of funding. We have a lot more money. We're ready to spend. Let's do it the right way. Well, you've lost a lot of time if you wait that long, and you probably could have built a more easy to understand reputation. So we probably, if you can, something you should concentrate on from the get-go.
Great. And so when someone is starting a company, a startup company, what's the advice that you give them in terms of thinking about branding from the get-go?
I think they should look at their audiences and say, okay, what's really missing in this marketplace that we need to make sure our brand is about? And then you match that with what's really special about you as a brand that's different from your competitors, because you don't want to be like everyone else. You'll see, for example, this isn't a startup, but one day it was with FedEx. It's very interesting that you see copycat companies that try and look exactly like FedEx. You don't want to be like everyone else because that just accrues equity to the biggest guy on the block, which is FedEx. So with startups, we try and say, let's not be like Apple. A lot of people will come in and make us look like Apple or make us feel like Apple. And we'll say, well, that's not really what you want to do. We want to figure out what's unique to you and what's going to resonate in the marketplace. And then let's create something that's going to be distinctive and invest in that so that you can grow your own voice. And I think if you look at Google way back when and where they are today, their distinction is because they really know what they stand for. And therefore, they've grown a brand from the beginning that's very powerful because they didn't try and be like everybody else. And they really, they kind of figured out what they wanted to be. And then they stayed with that over the arc of their growth, which has been phenomenal.
Yep. It's a great point. So, branding has been around for a long time and it's gone through many iterations. And so when you look at the field of branding, what do you see now? And what do you see in the future?
Well, it used to be we would create something and we even called it, I used to joke with clients that we were the people in the white coats in the laboratory and we would create this incredible strategy, amazing name and design. We'd codify it. We'd get it all done. And then we'd give it to the client, be very beautiful. And then we would help them to implement it. And they would push it out to their customers, their shareholders, whomever. It's not like that anymore. Clients want to be in the lab with us. And so it's very iterative now with clients. And also it then becomes very iterative with customers or clients or however they refer to their target audiences. So the whole cycle of branding has become much faster. It's also become much more participatory. So it's an amazing cycle now where you have people influencing, customers influence the brand influences people, and it just keeps changing as markets change. And so it's a lot more exciting than it used to be.
Great. You've had a really interesting trajectory from starting off as a teacher in Japan to having your own consulting firm now, and there was a lot of steps in between. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you've grown your business and how those different experiences, both in Japan and working at a big consulting firm, have really helped you get to where you are today?
It's been an interesting journey, I'll say that. I think starting off in Japan teaching English, it was a wonderful experience. It was a 2-year program. And when I came home after several months, I realized that I really hadn't finished that experience. I really wanted to learn more. I wanted to let myself be in Japan and really be immersed in the culture and figure out what was going on. So curiosity has driven a lot of my career choices. There's always been some type of question that I wanted to go and live in and figure out the answer by having the experience. So going back to Japan and joining an advertising agency was a huge risk. I didn't have a job when I left the US again. My boss from my old school had kind of, figured out how to get me an introduction to the ad agency, so a basic interview. And I was at a point in my life where I could take that risk. And I think that's important to think about. You have points in your life when you have nothing to lose. I didn't have a lot of debt to worry about at the time. I didn't have investors who were asking me to give them any type of return. I didn't own a home. It was easy to pick up everything and just leave. And so it was a good time to take that risk. And thankfully it worked out. I stayed in Japan for 3 years. But then you have to ask yourself, do I have a chance for advancement? And at that point, at that Japanese company, they weren't ready to promote a foreigner. My boss had tried, but it wasn't even the fact, people say, oh, was it because you were a woman? And I don't think that was the case. I think it was a Japanese company and they were very conservative. And so they were very nice about it. We had a great discussion. I had a great experience, but then it was like, okay, it's time to move on. And so wanting to do something different from advertising and just find out what's it like to be in a different type of environment drove me into management consulting. And that world of kind of, what's it like to be a management consultant was fascinating. I loved it, but then I missed the world of color and creativity. And not that it isn't, but when you get back into the creative world of advertising or branding, which is where I went, it just allows you to see your work come to life in very physical and tangible ways. And I've always been in love with the 3D experience, and whether that's branding a stadium or whether it's creating a video or whether it's seeing, the things you think about become a name, that's really fun. And then along the way, what's driven me to have my own business is wanting to see what it would be like to manage it, to really work with the operations side. What's it like to figure out a P&L? What's it like to figure out how much your profit margins should be? What's it like to figure out what your bill rate should be? So having that experience has been very enlightening, because you find out the things you're good at, you find out the things you're not good at, and then you find out, okay, who do I need to hire to do the things that I might not be that good at? And where do I need to then invest to grow? And so I think the fun part about going back and forth between industry, a corporate job, and then on my own has been it's teased out these different parts of myself that I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't know I was good at that. Or, wow, I'm really not that good at that. So I better find somebody to help me. And that's been fun. And that's driven a lot of my career decisions about when to change jobs and when to make another move.
Great. I love the point that you made about you realized at some point that you didn't have a lot to lose. So you just kind of went for it. And not everyone is fortunate enough to have those times. Like a lot of times they'll have a mortgage or kids or family they have to support. But if you find yourself in that moment where you really don't have a lot to lose, you don't hesitate, because there's not going to be that many moments like that. That's the time that if you're thinking about doing something else, like you should jump on it. And I think that people always think there's going to be more time or they don't feel ready. And so I think it's really important that you mentioned that. And that was actually, I had a time like that too. It was when I started my business where, there's never really a right time, but I didn't at that moment have a whole lot to lose. If it didn't work out, I would just go back to kind of what I had been doing before. And so when you have those moments, I really encourage you to take advantage of them. You make this sound kind of easy when you talk about your trajectory. You were in Japan, then you went back to the US, you went back to Japan, and it just seemed like the natural time. You had to run its course. You came back, you were a management consultant, and then you went off on your own. But that really is a big leap between having all those experiences working for somebody else and then starting your own company. So talk to me a little bit about what it was really like to get that first client and what you went through aside from the operational parts of the business. But how did you brand and sell yourself so that someone said, I want to hire you, your brand, rather than Accenture or some of these other agencies that you had been working for?
Well, I think you start branding yourself right from the get-go. I think you start branding yourself. Wow. I mean, you have to go back to grammar school because you're always trying to achieve something. You're trying to get on the sports team, and then you're trying to be varsity, or you're trying to be in the glee club, or whatever the interests you have that are outside of the normal track of what you're required to do. You have opportunities in life to step out and do more. And so it's just a question of how are you going to make the choice to do that? And so that's where you begin to brand yourself. So when I think about, stepping out to start my own business and what drove me to do that and what it was like with clients and building that brand, it's been building all the way. I think one of the most important things when you're in business is you're only as good as your next project. That's what a friend said to me one time. So always knowing that you have to do your best. And I work in a client service business. So clients, are my feedback loop. I don't wait for my manager to give me feedback. Clients actually know me better than some of my managers who might be in a different office or located in another city. I think clients kept asking me, what are you thinking about doing with your future? We'd be having dinner or on the road, and they would ask these questions. I'd say, I don't know, someday maybe I'll start my own thing, just kind of offhandedly. But one day a client said, when's going to be that time? And I said, I don't know. I'm waiting for the right time. He's like, there's never a right time. You just got to jump in. And I had a stroke of luck. I'll be honest. The office closed in San Francisco for the agency I was working for. And my client said, this is your time. And I'm like, you know what? It is my time, because I had all the planets aligned in that I could buy the office equipment from the agency that was closing at a very, very low price. Rents were surprisingly low at that moment in San Francisco. And I felt that if I really did a good job, I could keep the clients that still wanted to work with me without having any, issues with my existing agency that I would be leaving. So that's when you have to see. You have to look up. You have to, take yourself out of your own little existence and say, wow, could I do this? Yes, I can. It's the time. Jump in. And you have to look at then, what's your plan? And some people say, do you have a really big 30-page business plan? I'm like, no, I know how much money I have in my bank account. I know I have these office supplies. I know I can sign a rent thing because I can get somebody to, a bank to say, okay. You look at the first couple of steps. Do you have to have a 60-page business plan? I don't think so. I think you have to have the courage to say, what are the 5 moves I can make to get started? And one of them is, can I have clients? Yes. Can I get space? Yes. Can I, boom, boom, boom. And then do it. That's when you have to just pull the trigger, as they say.
Yeah, that's so true. You mentioned luck, and I talk about my experience a lot of the same way. I was just very lucky in how it all worked out. But people have pointed this out to me, and I would say the same thing to you. It's a little bit luck, but everything you were doing before led up to that moment. And then a window of opportunity happened. And so it was a combination of your past success and performance, as well as the right timing happening. And so part of being able to take advantage of those things is you have to really be alert to when those small windows of opportunity happen and to jump on them. So there is a small component of luck, but most people don't really find a whole successful career based on luck. It's really based on a consistent track record of performance and relationships, and then finding the right window of opportunity. And I agree with you of not needing a 60-page business plan. It obviously varies by the type of business you're in. You and I are both in consulting and advisory businesses. And so there's probably not as many operational considerations as there is if somebody has a tangible product or solution that they're bringing to market. And so, I really like the business model canvas tool. It's a 1-page tool where you can create a very lean business plan, but it makes you really think through all the key components that you need to get started. So while I am a huge fan of planning and having a business model, I am with you that, not every business requires this enormous business plan. And that's how people get stuck and sometimes never get off the ground with their business because they're focused so much on the paper and the planning.
Yeah, absolutely. I had friends from business school who, were trying to start their businesses, but they were getting caught up in 12th draft of their business plan. And they'd say, could you look at this draft again? And I'm like, are you using this as a way to kind of stall jumping into the pool of being a startup business? Just go for it. It's good enough.
Yep.
And I think sometimes you have to look at how you will course correct and put those plans in place. If this doesn't happen in January, February, okay, what are you going to do in March? And so, think ahead about how are you going to course correct versus having this locked down business plan that after the first month of business, you may have to adjust anyways. So I agree with you there.
So true. So tell us about a time when you've stagnated or stopped making progress. Speaking of course correcting, love to hear about your own personal experience in that space.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought I was very comfortable with risk, and I still think I'm comfortable with risk. But there was a time when a client who I was working with, we had to redo our contract because their company required it. And they brought in a new sourcing person. And that person was making some demands in the contract that would put our business at a risk that I thought was just completely untenable. I thought, wow, this is too much. I can't take these conditions. And so I got together with our lawyer and their lawyer. We really tried to hash it out. And my client sat in on some meetings. And at the end of the day, they just wouldn't budge. They said, here, you have to take these conditions. And this was going to be about a third of our financial, plan for the year. And so it was a big deal to think about, okay, I've already spent all this money on lawyer's fees. I really like this client. They've been a good client in the past. We've made some good money off with them. And I had to walk away. And it was really scary. It was a really scary moment because you have to, as the business owner, and you have a staff who are waiting to see what you're going to do. And some of them are saying, come on, let's go for it. We'll be fine. And others are like, well, I would never do that. And so you have to make that call. And then you have to explain to them, well, how are we going to make up that business that we're walking away from? And, what's going to happen tomorrow? And so making that decision, I really had to say, okay, who am I? And what do I believe about myself? What do I believe about my business? And so it came down to really kind of going back inside myself. And maybe that's partly because I'm an introvert that I had to soul search and make the decision. And I made the decision to walk away from that client. I've stayed, good friends with that person, but that was a tough moment because our business could have gone under or we would have had to lay people off. But then I kind of gave a speech to the office and we said, let's find it someplace else. We're the kind of people who are optimistic. We can go find the business someplace else. I'd rather take that risk, finding the new business, rather than taking on the risk that, this contract was asking me to absorb. So that was a toughie, but it was a good lesson for me.
That's a great example. I think a lot of business owners, myself included, you have those moments where you're like, this isn't feeling right. It's not feeling like the right move to continue to work with this client. And that is such a tough decision to walk away from either a client that you really like and you feel like you're really helping, or maybe the opposite, a situation where it's not going that well, but you know that the income is great and you need it. And it's just so hard. And every time I have to make a decision like that, like you, I do have to kind of do some soul searching, and I'm pretty extroverted. So I don't think it has to do with you being an introvert. It's like you have to really think about well, what's driving you to continue this relationship and how is this helping long term? And it's always scary to lose a client because then you have to go find something to replace it. But I've also never found that it had a long-term impact. It always opened up space for me to have new opportunities and new things, and pushed me to kind of think differently, either to get out of my comfort zone and reach out to people that maybe I wouldn't have, or to take up a little bit of a different take on something that I have been doing before. It pushes you to change how you're doing things a little bit if you have a void that you need to fill and fill it quickly. So I think what you're talking about is very relatable. And so if you're ever going through that situation with something where you feel like you have to give something up and lose a client, it's not always the right decision, but a lot of times in the long term, if your gut is telling you this isn't the way to proceed, it's a good idea to listen to your gut. And, might not work out, but I mean, sometimes I think your gut is a good indicator of the direction that you need to go. And when I've been in the same situation that you were in, Suzie, I haven't been let down when I've had to kind of walk away from something, even as hard as it may be.
Yeah, that's good. It's good advice for any person who's looking at, if you have a small office or even a big company, you have to really make the right decisions. And sometimes the right decisions is to walk away.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us about how you take time for yourself. You're running this business and you have a team of people and you're making difficult decisions like, when to walk away from clients and take on new work. How do you take that time for yourself and ensure that, you're healthy and you're managing your stress and doing the things you need to be happy?
It's such a great question because especially in the Bay Area with Silicon Valley and such a young culture here, you meet people who are just able to stay up 24/7. And if you're not that kind of person, you need to think about, how am I going to achieve what I want to achieve given who I am and the tools that I have? like your health, which is a tool. Being healthy is so important. I'm not burning the midnight oil. I've never been that kind of person. I love to sleep. So I really plan to exercise. I love to run. I love to cycle. This is a great area to do it in. So I've always made sure that I've planned that time. And part of the fun of having my own business is I can do that. But even when I was at Accenture, which people were like, oh, you're not going to have any time to exercise when you're a management consultant. We all would go running together after, a day. And then if we had to go back to the office, we would. And so I was so happy to see that there were other people who wanted to take time out to work out. When you're on the road, you just find the way to do it. If it's important to you, you commit to it. I also plan time to take pictures. I think it's important to keep a visual sense about myself and the work that I do. So I make sure that I get out, take a walk, and take photographs. If I can walk home instead of taking the bus home, I'll walk home, I'll bring my camera. So you just find ways to commit to certain things that you like to do and make sure that you do them. It's a promise to yourself. And that's what's going to keep you in the game longer, because you're going to be happy, you're going to be curious, and people are going to be attracted to that because they're not going to have time to do those things all the time. So they're going to want to ask you about that. So
that's so true. Great. Well, you've given us a lot of great nuggets to take from today's conversation, but let's go ahead and close with a final parting piece of guidance from you.
Well, no surprise, I think. You've got to know yourself. You have to be your best voice. And a lot of us don't listen to that little voice inside of us. We go out and we ask a lot of people for input, which I think is great. But always listen to that little voice when it's telling you something. I like to say when your brain and your heart agree, that's probably really significant. And so it's important to know that, because your gut is a very, very important piece of your success. And when you have a good relationship with listening to that and acting upon it, that doesn't mean you don't take advice from other people, but sometimes the best advisor is the voice inside your head. And I think you have to honor that.
Love that. The best advisor is the voice inside your head. So I hope today's episode inspires you to think more about how you can find your passion and live your best life. For more information, including links to resources that Suzie and I chatted about today and how best to get in touch with her, head on over to our website, theboostpodcast.com, and check out our show notes from this episode and catch the Boost bonus. Suzie, I want to thank you for sharing your journey with us today. And remember, anything is possible for you.
Now that you've completed this episode, the next step is to join the Boost Squad for strategic insights, tips, and tricks, as well as exclusive resources designed specifically to accelerate your personal and professional growth. All this and more is waiting for you at theboostpodcast.com.